This is a very short video just to start to introduce some of the customizations made to Enterprise Architect to support design and modeling of APIs, the web APIs. So I'm going to start off showing you, so what I have open is the web API Enterprise Architect project file. In that project file we have the web API folder, which has basically the root for all the various APIs that have been defined or in the process of being defined. I'm going to go through one particular API, and I'm going to open a diagram. This is the API diagram, and this file is used to produce a Raml file. What we're going to see is we're going to export that diagram as this Raml file. So what we do is we use the extension, the API MDG, it stands for Model Driven Generation, and we can export this diagram. And when we export it, it in fact produces that file. So I'll go back to editor, it will produce this file. Some of the properties here are defined directly on the diagram. So for instance, the API element here defines a version, a title. The API is this instance here is a instance of a classifier which comes from the meta model, and the meta model consists currently of API, the API class. An API class may have many resources. That resource may have many methods. And we'll explain this type for resource as we go through this, and the API can also have references to schemas. Basically this comes from the Raml structure. Let's go back to the API diagram. So we have a customer API, and it has a single resource which is going to expose customer details. There's a get method associated with that resource, and there's also this item get type for resource, which is basically the entity that corresponds in the Raml file to this entity here, which is in fact defined as a trait, and this is basically a parameterized template which requires these 4 parameters and will produce documentation and wrap up and link samples and the schemas together into this get method. So I can change the API, I can change the run state. So for instance, if I change the run state, if I change the version, the idea is, now that I've made that change, I can go ahead and regenerate that. I look back at and refresh this by reopening it. You'll see I've updated the version. These links in item get, which is basically saying item get the schema that I will use for information for the response info. That there is a link up to here, which is a link to this. That is reflected in this diagram by, in fact, that connection there, which is going from this instance of a type for resource to a class which corresponds to the root of the schema. As you can see here, there are 2 connections here from item get through to these 2 objects, which in fact we're going to see in a moment are roots of samples. And we're going to be able to generate not only the API, the Raml file, but also the schemas corresponding to the diagrams associated with these elements and the diagrams that corresponds to the samples. So let's go through and have a look at those. So if we go back to our folder structure, here we are. This is currently the API diagram. Underneath that we have samples in schema. If I go into schema, there's a couple diagrams in there. One is this schema corresponding to basically the domain model for the response to this method. Response is basically a customer which has a primary contact address, a secondary contact address, has an associated party type, some marketing information, contact details. So this is a schema for the response. It's been modeled as classes. It's linked to the API by that item get, which basically defines this entity as the root of the schema. With this diagram, I can choose to export the schema, and it will go through this model, and it will export a JSON schema file to the customer party schema.json. Let's go jump over to here. So in schemas, so it's produced this file. What we have here are all the properties of the root customer party, birthday, email address, so on and so forth. Some of these properties are going to refer to the contained or reference definitions, which happen to be rendered into this definitions section. So all the other entities, here's the enums, followed by some of the other models in the schema. Okay, so this is a valid JSON schema that has been created from this diagram. Likewise, samples can be produced. So this is a sample or an instance of that schema we were just looking at. It's modeled as objects which have classifiers which come from that schema. And in this case, we've got a customer party which has partner object, phone, marketing, and here's the primary contact and the secondary contact, which is just an email address. And likewise, I can choose to export this sample, and what gets produced is in the sample directory there's a JSON file which corresponds to the sample. So we can open that, which is customer sample, and here's the rendering of that diagram or model of a sample as a JSON in a JSON format. Okay. Sorry, that was the wrong one actually. Sorry. We should have actually been looking at this one. Partner details, secondary contact address, marketing, primary contact address, so on and so forth. And then likewise, the idea here is you can modify the sample values. So I can choose to put in the birth date as a particular value. Let's see, 2000. Whatever it may be. So I've updated that particular run state value on that instance of the customer party, and then I can export that sample and it would be reflected in that JSON file. So what we've seen is an ability to export APIs, export schemas, and export samples. And the whole point of this is to be able to produce the Raml file with valid samples and valid schemas, and for the whole Raml file to be valid. And the idea is to do that in a structure that also is going to have a reference to documentation that can be updated, and the traits and resource types, which are pretty much going to be constant across most APIs. So what we're doing when we're building an API is defining the version of the API, the resource, and the method. And for each method, there's a type for that resource method, which we can link particular schemas and particular samples. And that, of course, then produces documentation, such as what you see here on the right-hand side of this editor. Okay, so that's what I'm gonna stop this video now. and I'll follow it up with some more detail on how to create these diagrams from scratch.